At 72, George Brett remains one of the most immortal icons in American baseball history, a man who dedicated all 21 seasons to wearing only the Kansas City Royals jersey, becoming the soul of an entire city. He is the legend with over 3,154 hits, the only player in MLB history to win batting titles in 3 different decades, a man whose every swing made stadiums hold their breath. In 1980, he posted a legendary .390 season, coming closer than anyone in the modern era to the immortal .400 mark. In 1985, he was the heart of the Royals' journey to bring the first World Series ring to Kansas City, a moment that made him a hero of the Midwest. The 1983 Pine Tar game stunned the nation, but also cemented him as a symbol of pride and fierce fighting spirit. From an overlooked kid in El Segundo to the Hall of Fame in 1999 with near-unanimous votes, Brett's journey is not just achievement, it's proof that one person can change a city's destiny through effort and heart. Yet behind the roars of 40,000 fans from yesteryear, Brett's life is an epic of pain, sacrifice, and resilience. A childhood lacking warmth, constant comparisons, and a father telling him he wasn't good enough left a scar on his soul that the spotlight could never heal. His body was worn down over 2 decades of play, aching back, creaking knees, trembling hands, every swing a battle against pain itself. Old age arrived like a storm, fading eyesight, knees stiffening each morning, former teammates falling ill one by one, leaving him haunted by the question, "Why am I still standing here?" But those wounds forged the will of a warrior who never surrendered. Brett knows he can't run anymore, but he still stands tall, living with the pride of someone who gave everything and never betrayed the city that chose him as its legend. If you want to continue the journey into the darkness of George Brett Jr.'s childhood and the lesser-known years, hit subscribe to not miss the next part, and leave a like to join us in honoring a legend who paid the price with his entire life. At 72, when George Brett Jr. looks down at the silent Kauffman Stadium field, he doesn't just see past games but also the child he once was, a scrawny, timid boy, always standing at the edge of the family room, hearing others praised while he was not. To understand the man who became Kansas City's legend, we must go back to El Segundo in the 1950s, 1960s, where his first shadows were cast. To neighbors, the Brett family seemed like a classic American household, a strong veteran father, a quiet homemaker mother, 4 boys playing under the California sun, but behind those walls was a world where love was not easily shown. Jack Brett, the father old-timers called a real man, was strict to the point of harshness. He carried war wounds and a steely belief in discipline, which he passed to his sons through shouts, sudden slaps, sometimes punches that didn't always have a reason. And among the 4 brothers, the one who bore the brunt was George, the youngest, weakest, most overlooked. When Ken Brett, George's older brother, became a baseball phenom early on, the family began to revolve around Ken's glow. Relatives beamed with pride. Neighbors spoke of Ken as El Segundo's golden boy, and George, just the youngest, Ken's little brother, the kid who hasn't shown anything special. Those comparisons, intentional or not, cut into young George deeper than any pitch he'd face later. He grew up in a home where recognition was doled out sparingly, where his father only praised exceptional results, and where George, the gentle, quiet kid who struggled in school, always felt he stood behind everyone else. School wasn't much better. George wasn't a standout student. He wasn't good at math, language, or speaking up. When teachers called on him, he'd stammer, face flushing, words tangling. His peers, especially older kids, weren't cruel, but they barely noticed him. During recess, he'd retreat to a corner of the playground, alone with an old wooden bat, hitting balls against a fence as if trying to prove to himself he existed. At home, his mother, Ethel, was calm but reserved. She loved her kids in the way of that era's women, no hugs, few words, just meals and clean sheets. George loved her, but there was always a gap he couldn't bridge. No one in the house said, "I'm proud of you," or "You did great." Those simple words became something George craved to the point of heartbreak, and his story, through every season, every swing, was essentially a long, desperate quest to erase the feeling of not enough. As he grew, George began to feel the hierarchy in his own family. His three older brothers, especially Ken, were held up as the standard, while George was only called when chores needed doing, or when his father wanted to point out something he'd done wrong. It wasn't that his father didn't love him, it was that his love left no room for softness, and in the mind of a growing child, that lack of gentleness became a shame Brett carried his whole life. Years later, as an MLB legend with 3,154 hits and a hero to Kansas City, he said something that silenced those who heard it. "My father never told me he was proud of me. It wasn't a complaint, it was a confession from a wound that never healed. And that wound, the feeling of forever standing behind someone, unseen, unheard, not good enough, silently became the greatest driving force of Brett's life. That El Segundo darkness quietly forged the will of a man who would later face down all of America with an explosive swing, with the fury of the 1983 Pine Tar game, with the pride of a warrior who never bowed. But in those years, Brett wasn't a legend. He was just a kid trying to survive long days, lying in bed each night wondering, am I worth anything? And from that deepest darkness, the journey to becoming an American icon began. But the darkness of his El Segundo childhood was only the opening chapter. At 18, when he signed with the Kansas City Royals minor league system, George Brett Jr. still carried those invisible wounds, and he quickly found that the minors weren't a place for healing, but a place where those wounds would be carved deeper. The minor leagues of the 1970s weren't the glamorous image people associate with baseball. No bright lights, no massive grandstands, no cheers from tens of thousands, just rickety buses hauling players across hundreds of miles, engines groaning like they might die, seats hard as wood, the air thick with the smell of sweat and worn leather, players curled up, using backpacks as pillows, many sleeping upright because there was no room to stretch out. George, the youngest once dismissed, now had to blend into a group of rough men, each fighting to hold on to a fragile MLB dream. In small towns, they stayed in cheap motels with moldy carpets, stained walls, showers that ran hot one second and cold the next. Some nights, Brett stuffed towels under the door to block the musty smell. Meals were often cold hamburgers, cheap pizza, or sandwiches so dry you had to gulp water to swallow. Minor league pay was barely enough to scrape by. Brett counted every dollar in his pocket, picking the cheapest menu item to save gas money for the next bus trip. On the field, things were no easier. Brett wasn't a prodigy like his brother Ken. Early on he made constant errors, hit poorly, threw inaccurately, let balls slip through his glove. Older teammates looked at him and shook their heads. One coach said bluntly, "Soft, he's soft, won't make it." Those words were a knife twisting into the same childhood wound. Not good enough. Never good enough. And true enough, Brett was repeatedly sent down, called up, then sent down again. Each demotion felt like the MLB door slamming shut once more. The familiar feeling of abandonment from his El Segundo years flooded back. Once he played so badly, he was pulled from the lineup mid-series. That night, in a dingy Omaha motel room, he turned on the shower and sat on the cold bathroom floor, letting the water's sound drown out the choke in his throat. He didn't want teammates to hear him cry. It wasn't just the pain of a bad game. It was the pain of a young man who believed his life was slowly collapsing, just like when his father looked at him with disappointment as a child. He later recalled, "I thought I'd be cut forever. I didn't think I was good enough." But baseball has a cruel truth. It doesn't give you time to grieve. You either get up or get left behind. Every morning Brett still had to step onto the practice field, even after crying in the bathroom the night before. He ran laps, hit off tees, did drills until his hands blistered, but he didn't quit. A young coach once said, "George isn't the strongest or the fastest, but he has something others don't." Shame turned into determination. That shame, the kind that had haunted him since childhood, became a powerful engine. Brett knew that if he gave up he'd never escape his brother's shadow, never break the not good enough curse his father had unwittingly planted. So he threw himself into training like a drowning man gasping for air. Days on empty fields, nights under dim yellow practice lights, swings repeated to exhaustion, all built a soul of iron, one that would stand firm against MLB storms later. The minors are where people quit, but they're also where true warriors are forged. In the poverty, grime and brutality of those broken-down buses, Brett found what he'd lacked as a child, a will to survive. He saw only two paths: be crushed like countless nameless players, or turn humiliation into fuel to go further than anyone thought he could. And George Brett Jr. chose the second path. When the grueling minor league journey had just begun to toughen George Brett Jr.'s skin, he was called up to the Kansas City Royals, carrying the hope that he had finally reached the big leagues of baseball. But MLB, like his childhood, didn't welcome him with open arms. It only cracked the door wide enough for him to step through before slamming it shut, testing whether he had the grit to withstand the impact. Brett debuted in 1973, and within the first few weeks, the MLB dream he'd cherished since childhood began to fracture. Errant throws sent balls rolling into the outfield. Missed swings and prolonged strikeouts drew jeers from the stands. One disastrous game saw him pulled mid-match under the cold stares of the crowd. As Brett returned to the dugout, a few fans shouted, "Send him back. He's not ready. Send him down again. This guy's not good enough." Those words pierced him like knives, echoing a version of the phrase he'd heard throughout his youth: "You're not good enough." MLB had little patience for big or frequent mistakes. In an era when the Royals were searching for a new icon, Kansas City's press didn't miss the chance to dissect the young call-up. One local paper wrote bluntly, "This kid isn't the savior Kansas City's been waiting for." The sentence appeared in the sports section, but it loomed in Brett's mind, like his father's voice echoing from decades past. Each error didn't just show the crowd's disappointment, it conjured his father standing on the old El Segundo porch, eyes icy, with the unspoken words, "Ken could do it, why can't you?" The pressure made Brett so tense that every time he stepped up to the plate, the bat felt twice as heavy. He tried to prove himself, but the harder he tried, the worse he played. One day, after a game with two costly errors, Brett sat alone in the locker room, eyes red. A teammate patted his shoulder as he passed, but Brett said nothing. Inside, a growing fear consumed him, that all those minor league years, those nights crying in motel bathrooms, all that desperate effort, might have been for nothing. His first season became a string of days filled with self-doubt. Brett's batting average was low, his defense inconsistent. Each missed hit dragged him deeper into the pit of childhood despair. Kansas City fans were blunt, the media cold, and Brett himself was riddled with inner doubt. Then came the hardest blow to his pride, a near demotion back to the minors. When a coach told Brett he might have to go back to Omaha, his heart shattered. It wasn't just the threat of losing his spot, it was a replay of the emotional bankruptcy of his youth, being dismissed, pushed aside, deemed useless. That night, Brett drove alone through Kansas City's dark streets, windows down, letting the cold wind slap his face like a punishment. He drove aimlessly, trying to numb the stinging in his chest. He remembered El Segundo, when his father didn't come to his games, even though they were just minutes from home. He recalled the comparisons to his brother, the times he was called short, weak, not tough enough. And now, even MLB seemed to be saying the same. But in that dark night, in a quiet moment in a deserted stadium parking lot, Brett made a decision that would change his life: either accept being the failure others labeled him, or fight to his last breath. There was no other choice. From then on, Brett trained at a level that worried others. He arrived at the field before everyone, left after all were gone. He worked to refine every swing, every defensive move, every throw to base. Brett no longer played to prove himself to coaches or fans. He played to prove to the kid who cried in motel bathrooms that he deserved a chance. Those early Royals years weren't the dreamy start of a prodigy. They were a brutal battlefield where Brett nearly drowned in his own fears. But they were also where he began forging the true steel of a legend. Steel made from shame, doubt, the anger of being underestimated, and an unwavering resolve never to be invisible again. After those months teetering on the edge, with the threat of being sent back to the minors looming once more, George Brett Jr. stood at a threshold where many young players had fallen. But at the moment when it seemed he had nothing left to cling to, life brought him to the one man who could see through the layers of disappointment and insecurity weighing on his young shoulders. Charlie Law, later known by a near-sacred name in Brett's heart, the hitting whisperer. The first day Law watched Brett at practice, he didn't see a bad player. Instead, he saw a locked-up energy, a body with instinctive skill distorted by pressure, a mind swinging as if fighting the whole world. When practice ended, Law approached Brett, who was sitting with his head down, as if wanting to be unseen, and said words Brett would never forget. "George, you're not bad, you just haven't been coached right." It wasn't praise, it was the first time someone truly saw him. For the first time since childhood, he heard words that let him believe in himself, not as Ken Brett's shadow, not as the overlooked kid in the family, not as the struggling rookie in Kansas City's papers, but as a person with real worth. Those words touched the deepest part of Brett, where he hid his shame, his shyness, the fear he'd always be not good enough. From that moment, Brett was ready to give his soul to whatever Law asked. Law started by completely breaking down Brett's swing. He told Brett to forget every habit he'd learned, every instinct he'd trusted, change hand position, stance, breathing, even the timing of hip rotation. "If you want to be the best in the world, you have to start from zero," Law said. And Brett did exactly that. Their training sessions stretched hours after teammates left. When the stadium lights dimmed, leaving only faint yellow glows, Brett's bat still swung over 1,000 times each evening. His gloves wore out, the skin on his palms tore until they bled. Some days Brett soaked his hands in ice buckets to ease the burning, then picked up the bat and hit again. Law never praised Brett, not in the usual way, but he stood there, watching, correcting every millimeter of movement. When Brett swung wrong, Law didn't yell. He put a hand on his shoulder and said, "Come on, you can do it. I know you can." It was something Brett had never heard from his father, and a miracle happened bit by bit. Brett's swing unlocked a new world. His hits grew smoother, stronger, more consistent. Brett began to feel a connection between his body and bat he'd never understood before. But the biggest change wasn't technique, it was how he saw himself. One practice, after a string of perfect hits, Law walked over and said quietly, "George, remember this, you're a lot better than you think." Brett turned away, not wanting Law to see his eyes redden. To Brett those words meant more than any MVP or World Series he'd later win. They were the validation he'd waited his whole life for. Law had seen the forgotten child in Brett, and gave that boy the belief to stand tall for the first time. The months that followed were Brett's rebirth. Each time he stepped into the batting cage, teammates started pausing to watch. They whispered, "This kid's getting different. His swing's looking clean." Brett heard but didn't look back. He just focused on hitting, as if sealing shut every painful childhood door with the strength of his own hands. Charlie Law didn't just teach Brett how to hit, he taught him how to stand tall against adversity. He taught him to trust sweat, effort, and starting over without shame. He taught him he wasn't the forgotten kid, that he could be something America would remember. And slowly, from the wreckage of doubt and insecurity, a hitting genius began to take shape. Not a born genius like his brother Ken, not someone destined to be a superstar, but a genius forged by pain, tears, and a coach who saw light in the darkness of young George Brett. And for the first time in his life, Brett began to believe he could be something more than good enough. He could be great. The year 1980 arrived for George Brett Jr. like a promise from the heavens, something every athlete waits for, but few ever touch. It was the season when everything he'd learned from Charlie Lau, every drop of sweat from the minor leagues, every scar from a dark childhood, converged into a fierce blazing fire, so bright that all of America had to turn and look. But the brighter the flame, the longer the shadow behind it. And never was Brett's darkness deeper than in that, his most beautiful season. At 27, Brett entered the 1980 season with a form even he couldn't explain. Every swing flowed through his body, every contact followed a law only he could hear. Line drives tore through the air, ground balls pierced the infield, home runs soared as if weightless. The press began writing about George Brett's magic summer, fans held signs reading .400 or nothing, and national TV called him the modern era's last hope to reach the mythical 400 mark. But behind each dazzling moment, Brett was a man living in pain. A pain no one knew, no one guessed, no one could imagine. He entered the season with a body betraying him daily. His groin burned so fiercely that every sprint felt like a knife's cut. Sudden abdominal cramps struck mid-game, doubling him over on the field. Chronic back pain plagued him for months, requiring trainers to realign his spine after every game. And worst of all, the condition the press mocked with cruel relish was hemorrhoids that forced him to leave games early. No one knew that when Brett clutched his stomach and left the field, face pale, it wasn't drama, wasn't weakness, wasn't show. It was a body stretched to the brink of breaking. But the media, as always, stood at a distance and laughed. One paper wrote, "How can our 400 hope leave the game because of hemorrhoids? How can our .400 hope quit because of hemorrhoids?" The jab spread across America. In bars, people retold the story as a joke. On TV, commentators smirked. But only Brett and the team's nurse knew the truth. He had nearly collapsed on the field. Each time he stepped into the batter's box, he fought pain by clenching his thighs and shifting his weight to the right, nearly ruining his swing mechanics. Yet, strangely, the more it hurt, the better he hit. As if the pain unlocked a new level of focus, a plane only those who've endured enough damage can reach. America began tracking Brett's every hit like a national heartbeat. They watched not just for the 400 chase, but because Brett had become a symbol of resilience. A man fighting his own body, fighting the era's mockery, fighting the childhood shadow of not good enough. Every game, cameras caught Brett wincing after a swing. Fans thought it was focus. The press thought it was anger. But the truth was simpler. Pain. Pain so intense he wanted to collapse on the spot. Teammates later said they saw him alone in the locker room, ice packs strapped around his waist, sweating profusely, breathing heavily. Some days he couldn't bend to tie his shoes. Some days doctors injected painkillers mid-game because he couldn't stand. But the moment he stepped onto the field, he became a beast capable of shredding pitches with swings so beautiful they stunned. That feeling, the moment pain vanished as bat met ball, was the only thing keeping him upright. And then the miracle took shape. By August 1980, Brett's batting average hit .407. America erupted. The press called it Ted Williams' unfinished business. The nation looked to Brett as a timeless hope, but what America didn't know was that behind every number was a new pain, a new sleepless night, a new massage so brutal it brought tears. He neared .400 like a man running toward a flame. The closer he got, the more it burned. And then at season's end, the number settled at .390, just .010 short, just a fraction of a hit shy of Brett becoming an immortal legend. The press called it a perfect season, fans called it a magic summer, history called it one of the greatest campaigns in modern baseball. But Brett, he lay in a dark room after the final game, hand over his eyes, seeing no victory. Only a deep sadness no one understood. He whispered to a teammate, "I let them down again," because to Brett, .390 wasn't a miracle. It was a reminder that, despite fighting through a season of pain, he was still missing something, like his childhood, like his early Royals years close, but not enough. And in that sense of falling short, another transformation in Brett's heart began to form, one that would lead him to even greater battles ahead. The summer of 1980 closed with the radiant glow of the .400 chase, but as October arrived, the month of destiny, when legends are born or crushed, George Brett Jr. understood that true greatness lay not in numbers, but in the World Series. The Kansas City Royals had never won a championship. The city had endured too many years of disappointment, too many playoff exits steeped in regret. Now they faced their greatest chance in history, a matchup against the Philadelphia Phillies. Brett entered the series with a near-desperate resolve, not just for the team, not just for Kansas City, but for himself. He wanted to shake off the .010 shortfall, weighing on his heart from the .400 chase, to prove to his father, his past, the world, that he was no longer the boy who was not good enough. And Brett played as if his soul were ablaze. Despite lingering pain, Despite a body exhausted from a grueling season, Brett stepped into each at-bat like a transcendent machine, a warrior who'd left fear behind. He ripped line drives through the middle infield. He smashed doubles that forced Phillies pitchers out early. Some games he hit as if defying gravity, making Kansas City's stands believe fate was on their side. But baseball is always cruel to those who want too much. Despite Brett playing so brilliantly that broadcasters exclaimed, "George Brett is carrying them on his back," the Royals fell in the World Series. The Phillies were stronger, deeper, luckier. They had clutch pitches, timely hits Kansas lacked. And then the decisive loss came. As the cheers fell silent, as Philadelphia's stadium exploded in red victory, Brett stood frozen amid the chaos. He didn't cry, he didn't rage. He felt only a familiar sting sharper than any pitch, the feeling of letting an entire city down. After the series, the players returned to the locker room. The sounds of cleats being removed, metal clanging against lockers, heavy sighs blended into a thick sorrow. But in that space, Brett said nothing. He walked to the dim corner of the locker room, where the yellow light only half reached him, and sat on a wooden chair, head bowed, bat at his side like a wound left behind. No one dared approach. No one knew what to say. Because they understood Brett had played with his entire soul. He'd played with a body no longer whole, and the Royals didn't lose because of him. But in Brett's heart, logic had no place, only guilt. Guilt as deep as the years he grew up feeling he'd disappointed his father again. Except this time, it wasn't his father. This time it was a city that had placed its faith in him. People remember Brett at the peak of 1980, the smile, the magical hits, America cheering every time he stepped to the plate. But few recall a far more haunting image, a George Brett sitting in the locker room, eyes vacant, as if the world were crumbling before him, and he could do nothing to stop it. His collapse wasn't like Simon Cowell's fanfare collapse, born of bankruptcy and bad decisions. Brett's was pure, human and achingly painful, the agony of a man who'd given everything, fought with every cell in his body, yet still couldn't change fate. That night, as the stadium closed, Brett remained in his seat. A staffer passing by later said he saw Brett raise a hand to his face, not to wipe tears, but to hide his expression, as if ashamed of failing before millions. But no one in Kansas City felt Brett had failed, only he did. Because his heart, from childhood to his prime, always believed that if he wasn't perfect, he wasn't enough. And the 1980 World Series, though the most glorious moment of Brett's career, was also the sharpest blow to the heart of a man who spent his life fearing he'd let others down. Yet in that devastation, something strange took root. Brett realized that one day he'd have to return here, not to save Kansas City, but to save himself. The 1980 World Series left a smoldering wound in George Brett Jr., and 3 years later, when MLB's spotlight fell on him during the Yankees-Royals game on July 24, 1983, that wound finally erupted into a fire America would talk about for decades. It wasn't a pitch, a hit or a personal scandal. It was a home run, taken away. A moment baseball thought would fade into obscurity, but thanks to Brett's fury, it became a slice of history. It was the ninth inning, Royals trailing the Yankees 4-3 at Yankee Stadium. Goose Gossage, legendary pitcher with a deadly fastball, stood on the mound. Brett, long accustomed to carrying Kansas City's hopes, stepped to the plate. Gossage threw a tough pitch, but Brett crushed it into a home run so perfect, the crowd fell silent for a moment. Royals led 5-4. Brett rounded the bases amid his teammates' elation. It should have been redemption after the sorrows of 1980, but baseball, like every chapter of his life, never gave Brett a simple victory. Billy Martin, Yankees manager, suddenly stepped out and demanded the umpires check the pine tar on Brett's bat, a rule rarely used to nullify a home run at the time. The umpires measured the bat and declared the home run invalid, all because the pine tar extended beyond 18 inches, a trivial technicality offering no real advantage. But rules were rules, and Brett, who'd endured a lifetime of being underestimated, dismissed, told as a child he was not enough, who'd traded blood and flesh to bring glory to Kansas, couldn't take it anymore. When the umpire signaled the home run's cancellation, Brett exploded from the dugout like a cannon shot. Eyes blazing, face red, fists clenched, body taut, as if it might burst. He roared, charging at umpire Tim McClelland, as if to tear apart the injustice before him. It wasn't just a player's reaction to a lost point, it was the scream of a lifetime of suppressed pain. Everything, his childhood compared to his brother, minor league nights crying in motel bathrooms, mocking headlines, the World Series disappointment poured into that eruption. The world laughed. TV replayed Brett charging like a man, unhinged hundreds of times. Comedy shows parodied the moment. Papers printed his photo with witty headlines. But beneath the laughter was something deeper, truer. They understood. America understood. They saw a man who had endured too much, a heart with no room left for more injustice, a warrior who finally exploded when his achievement was erased for a reason so petty, it was pathetic. And that moment, though Brett never intended it, turned him into a national icon. Not an icon of perfection, not of technique, but of raw humanity. That rage wasn't the arrogance of a star. It was the rage of millions of Americans under pressure, underestimated, misjudged, overlooked. In that fury, people saw themselves. But for Brett, amid the national clamor, the attention and the mockery, he didn't see a legend. He only saw pain. Years later he admitted, "I wasn't mad about the pine tar, I was mad about feeling robbed, disrespected. I was mad for all the times before in my life." The pine tar game didn't make Brett. It only exposed what had been smoldering inside him for years. When the game ended, when Yankee Stadium's lights went out, Brett sat alone in the locker room, a storm of emotions in his heart, anger, exhaustion, and a strange relief. Because for the first time in his life, he didn't swallow his anger. For the first time he let the world see the wounds he'd kept hidden, and that not the stolen home run, carved George Brett Jr. into America's heart in a way no one expected. The pine tar game was a moment of chaos, but for Brett, it was the moment he stopped being the invisible child. It was when America, at last, saw him. The 1983 World Series passed with mocking laughter and emotional eruption, but 1985 opened a wholly different chapter, one George Brett Jr. wrote not just with his bat, with his blood, but with his very soul. It was the year when all the pain, all the dismissal, all the childhood wounds, all the seasons on the brink of collapse converged into a single moment, the Royals' first World Series championship in history. For Kansas City, it was a miracle. For MLB, it was a shock. But for Brett, who'd carried the city's expectations for over a decade, it was a belated answer to a lifetime of being told, "You're not good enough." The press called 1985 the George Brett postseason masterclass. Pitchers from Toronto and St. Louis, confident they'd crush the Royals, were felled by Brett's cold, precise, thunderous hits. In Game 3 of the ALCS, Brett went 4 for 4, including a seismic home run that shook Royals Stadium. Analysts said, "That's not a man, that's a storm named Brett." But only Brett knew he wasn't playing for titles. He was playing to prove that pain had worth, that the years labeled soft, the seasons mocked, the nights crying alone in motel bathrooms, the swings that tore his hands, the abdominal cramps that nearly dropped him, all led him here. When the Royals finally defeated the St. Louis Cardinals in Game 7, the stadium erupted. Teammates rushed the field, the city wept like never before, and Brett, he stepped back, gazing at the scene like a man before a door locked for 15 years, finally opened. He removed his cap, bowed his head, then collapsed into his hands, sobbing like a child. Not tears of victory, tears of release. Chewing gum fell from his mouth, his cap hit the ground. Brett buried his face in his glove, choking on sobs. Teammates thought it was joy, but inside Brett, a lifetime was melting. His father's old shouts, "You lost again," the comparisons to his brother, the years branded not good enough, the painful seasons, the mocking press, the swings in cold night practices, all flooded back. In that moment, Brett felt he'd finally thrown off the heavy stone strapped to his chest since childhood. After the championship ceremony, as champagne soaked the locker room walls, as the team reveled in euphoria, Brett quietly slipped away from the noise, finding a small corner in the tunnel to the field. A stadium worker later said he saw Brett standing alone, leaning against the wall, eyes still red, clutching his glove like a memory. He said softly, "Dad, I finally did it." This wasn't a Hollywood moment. It was the raw moment of a man demanded of his whole life, forever trying to prove he wasn't worthless. When Brett slid the championship ring onto his finger, he knew it wasn't just jewelry. It was the crystallization of everything he'd sacrificed. And the cost was steep. Health. His body was so worn that doctors warned he was aging a decade faster than his years. Youth. While friends lived freely, Brett played 162 games a season. Family years nearly absent from home, returning after his kids slept, leaving before they woke. Soul. Insecurity didn't vanish. It only retreated, waiting in quiet moments. The 1985 victory didn't erase that darkness. It only taught Brett something deeper. Glory isn't pure light. It's light mixed with joy, pain, sacrifice, and voids that can never be filled. Winning the World Series proved to the world he was enough, but it couldn't prove to him he deserved happiness. The celebration night passed, but Brett didn't sleep. He sat on his hotel balcony, watching Kansas City glow with joy, feeling a faint sadness no one could explain. I won, but why do I still feel empty? Because deep in his mind, the darkness never left. It stood behind the glory, patiently waiting for him to turn back. And Brett knew his greatest battles still lay ahead. The 1985 glory lifted George Brett Jr. to America's peak, but that same moment opened a crueler chapter, one where his body began demanding back everything it had been forced to give for over a decade. Brett was now Kansas City's icon, but also a man who'd traded too much flesh and bone for that World Series ring. And as the lights dimmed after the parades, as the cheers faded under Missouri's cold winter winds, Brett finally heard his body scream, "Enough." But he couldn't stop, not when Kansas City still needed him, not when he still carried his life's greatest fear, returning to the useless boy his father once dismissed. After 1985, the pains came with terrifying frequency. His back hurt so much that each morning, Brett had to grip the bed's edge to sit up slowly, like a man a decade older than his age. Tying his shoes, he'd pause to catch his breath. His knees creaked with every run, cartilage worn, joints swollen, ligaments stretched near breaking. On cold days, he'd descend stairs with legs trembling like someone relearning to walk after an accident. His wrists, the fulcrum of every swing, throbbed as if drilled into the bone, yet he still had to hit, still had to lift the bat, still had to step into the batter's box with a leader's aura. No one knew that after many games, Brett soaked his hands in ice until they turned purple to ease the pain. No one saw him lie on the locker room floor, wet towel over his back, breathing deliberately to keep from crying. No one heard the small groans escaping at night, when he turned, and his hip felt like it might snap. But the next morning, before sunrise, Brett stood before the mirror, pulled the Royals jersey over his head, adjusted his belt, and stepped onto the field, as if his body were still the steel of 19. He once said, "If I give up, I'll be that worthless kid again." It wasn't bravado, it was real fear. For Brett, baseball wasn't just a job. It was the only thread tying him to his sense of worth. Quitting meant retreating to a dark past where he was dismissed, compared, seen as futureless. So Brett chose to endure. He traded pieces of his lifespan to keep wearing that blue number 5 jersey. Some days he thought his body couldn't take another swing, but then he'd hear fans chant his name. He'd think of kids seeing him as a hero. He'd think of small Kansas City, living in the shadow of giants like New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, yet proud to have a legend who never left them. And for all that, he'd slip on his glove, run to the field, swing until his hands bled. Many nights after games, Brett drove home in silence, one hand on the wheel, the other on his knee to ease the stabbing pain. Sometimes he'd pull over, gasping, because his back hurt too much to keep sitting. Doctors repeatedly warned, "George, your body's aging 10 years too fast." But Brett just shook his head. He didn't need reminders. He felt it daily, but stopping wasn't an option, because he knew the Royals didn't need a perfect player. They needed a symbol of resilience. And Brett, though his body was breaking, wanted to be that pillar. He still ran to base after every hit, though slower each year. He still dove for classic slides, though standing up meant gritting his teeth to hide the pain. And he still smiled at teammates, though that smile sometimes masked nights of torment. Time is an opponent no athlete defeats. But Brett was different. Though time crushed his body, it never crushed his will. In the years after 1985, he was no longer the team's fastest or strongest, but he became something irreplaceable, the heart of the Kansas City Royals. A cracked, aching heart, but one that beat for those he loved. And Brett knew his war with time was only beginning. When the 1993 season ended, George Brett Jr. stepped into his final game, a day when all of Kansas City held its breath. At 40, his body ravaged by time, his spirit remained a warrior's. That day, each step Brett took from the dugout gripped the crowd's hearts. As he approached the plate for the last time, there was no clamor, no heckling, no pressure for stats. Only thunderous applause, stretching so long he had to look up to stop tears from spilling. Kansas City stood, not for the hit he might make, but for the life he'd devoted to them. He bowed his head, gently tipped his cap, eyes red like embers. When the game ended, Brett walked off the grass for the last time, hand grazing the foul line as if touching his own memories. Fans wept like they'd lost family, and Brett fought to stay composed as he passed the places he'd known for over 2 decades, where he'd triumphed, failed, suffered, and risen. That day he didn't walk fast, he walked slowly, as if each step was a goodbye to a piece of his soul. But what he didn't expect was that the cruelest moment wouldn't happen on the field, but when he returned home. The first night after retirement, when the bedroom lights went out, no more cleats clicking on the locker room's wooden floor, no more 40,000 voices roaring, was the first night he faced absolute silence, and that silence was more terrifying than any injury, scandal, or crisis he'd ever confronted. Brett sat in his living room chair, TV off, house soundless, only the clocks ticking audible. He rested his hand on his knee too sore to straighten, but the physical pain wasn't what choked him. It was the empty question, without baseball, who am I? Like Simon Cowell after losing the spotlight, Brett entered a dangerous identity void no medal could fill. His entire life was baseball. Every morning had a purpose, every day had a game, every year had hope, but now he had none of that. No schedule, no teammates, no locker room, no chalk-dusted dugout, no crack of bat on ball, no fans screaming for his doubles, no one waiting for him to appear, no one needing him at the plate. And for Brett, a man who'd spent his youth proving he was good enough, that absence made him feel like he was dissolving. In the weeks that followed, he didn't know what to do with himself. He woke at 7 a.m., his usual practice time, but stood frozen in the kitchen, unsure where to go. He drove to the stadium out of habit, only to park outside the gate, staring at Kauffman Stadium like a stranger. Locals greeted him with respectful smiles, but as they moved on, Brett felt the world advancing while he stood still. Once surrounded by fans daily, he now faced empty seats and vast parking lots. That silence ate at him from within. A former teammate once said, George couldn't handle the emptiness. He needed the sound, the team's pulse. He needed people leaning on him. Brett tried finding joy in normal life, but for a man who'd lived as an icon, normalcy was a burden. Nights without games left him aimless. Mornings without bats and balls made him feel useless. He began to ask a question sharp as a blade. Without playing, am I still worth anything? His family tried to comfort him, but no one could fill the void of 21 years. Brett had played like a warrior, to avoid becoming that invisible child again, but retirement made him feel he was reverting to that boy, the one behind his brother, dismissed, unnoticed. The cheers had turned to silence, and that silence forced Brett to face what he feared more than failure, a life without applause. And Brett knew he had to find a way to stand tall, not on the field, but in the silence he'd never learned to endure. After those initial months drowned in the silence of post-retirement life, George Brett Jr. began to confront something he'd never dared face during his 21 years of playing family. Not the framed photos on the wall, not the full family appearances at Royals events, but the fragments of memories he'd missed and could never reclaim. For 2 decades, Brett lived by the 162-game seasonal grind, plus spring training, postseason, flights, practices, and strategy meetings. When people spoke of an MLB season, they saw stadium lights. His wife Leslie saw a home mostly without its man. While Brett traveled with the team to Seattle, Boston, or Baltimore, Leslie managed alone, driving kids to school, attending parent meetings, caring for sick children, fixing broken pipes, facing holidays without her husband. She loved Brett fiercely, but that love didn't lighten her loneliness. MLB players' wives often joked, "We're single moms during the season, with husbands in October." For Leslie, it wasn't a joke, it was reality. While Brett became a city's legend, he was a secondary figure in his own home. His children, Jackson, Dylan, Robin, grew up seeing their father mostly on TV. They watched him hit home runs on screens more often than they sat with him at dinner in a years. While America celebrated Brett, his kids went to bed not knowing which city he was in. And Brett, in his chase for perfection, didn't see those precious moments slipping away. Retirement's baseball void suddenly revealed a larger one. He'd missed the childhoods of the children he loved most. One evening, months after retiring, Brett flipped through a family photo album. He saw his son taking first steps, but couldn't recall being there. He saw his eldest playing Little League, but the memory was blank. He saw birthday, Christmas, Thanksgiving photos, and noticed his face rarely appeared. It wasn't anyone's fault, it was the price every professional athlete pays. But for Brett, who'd lived to prove his worth, realizing he was absent from his family hit harder than any 95 pitch that ever struck him. One night, with only the kitchen lamp casting faint yellow light over the quiet house, Brett asked Leslie, "Was I a bad father?" Leslie didn't call him bad. She told the truth, that he did what he thought was right, that baseball fed the family, that he never forgot to write, call or check in from afar. But it didn't erase the reality. Brett wasn't there. And absence has impact, even with love intact. Those questions haunted Brett for weeks, months. Was I really a good father? His love for his kids never wavered, but love couldn't replace time, and time can't be reclaimed, so Brett resolved to make up for it. He took his kids fishing, taught them to throw, drove cross-country to be with them at college. He showed up for every event he'd once missed. He stopped checking his phone around family. He learned to listen more than speak. He was present for every small moment, something he hadn't done for half his life. But Brett knew a cruel truth: making up doesn't replace, it only eases the wound. Once his youngest son asked, "Dad, do you remember when I was in that fourth grade play?" Brett fell silent. He didn't remember. He was at a Minnesota stadium that night. Moments like that tormented him through sleepless nights. He'd battled MLB's best pitchers, but this was a fight he felt he could lose, the fight against his past. Yet Brett didn't quit, because family, the thing baseball once stole, now was his only salvation to rediscover himself after the cheers faded. To many, this was a mild tragedy, but for Brett, it was a real quiet, piercing tragedy, not in headlines or on TV, but in the hearts of those he loved. And he understood that the 1985 championship ring, though precious, couldn't warm an empty chair at the dinner table, couldn't replace the years he'd missed, couldn't tell his kids he wished he could go back to hold them one more time when they were small. Age 70 came to George Brett, not like a warm sunset, but like a cold wind blowing from behind, signaling that his strongest days were truly gone. As he crossed into his 70s, his body, the companion that fought with him for over half a century, began crumbling like an old bridge unable to withstand another storm. And every morning Brett opened his eyes, felt like a new battle, one he couldn't win but couldn't abandon. Joint pain came first. At first, it was mild with weather changes. Then, each time he stepped out of bed, his knees felt like stones grinding together. Doctors named it arthritis, joint degeneration, a disease that doesn't kill but kills freedom. His back, once the pillar for swings that erupted stadiums, now stiffened like rusted steel. Some days he had to brace against the wall for minutes to straighten it before leaving the bedroom. His wrists, which crafted hits that captivated America, weakened until opening a bottle made him wince. His vision blurred, phone numbers smeared, morning papers had to be held close to read. At home, he turned on extra lights to avoid tripping over table corners. For most, a 70-year-old's morning is a gentle start. For Brett, it was a fight to stand. Doctors sternly warned, If you don't cut back on heavy activity and follow strict therapy, you could lose the ability to walk. Brett froze. He'd never imagined himself, the man who ran bases like the wind, who hit balls with hurricane force, now threatened by walking. He followed the doctors, having no choice. But each time he stepped onto the therapy machine, each time he slowly rotated his hips as instructed, he felt like he was staring at an aged version of himself in the mirror, and that hurt more than any injury from youth. Beyond physical decay, what stung more at 70+ was watching teammates slip away, the men he fought alongside, shared locker rooms with, drank beers with after wins, consoled after losses. Their names began appearing in obituaries. Some died of heart disease, some of cancer, some slipped away quietly in sleep. Brett realized he was attending more funerals than celebrations. His morning call list to check on friends grew shorter. Often at a funeral, he'd see a teammate's old baseball jersey on the casket, and suddenly his own future stared back, a cruel reminder that his generation was fading, one person, one light at a time. A former teammate, Frank White, once said, "We thought we were immortal, but we aged too fast." Brett understood that better than anyone. Each time he stood by a teammate's grave, he didn't just mourn them, he mourned his own youth, the prime now existing only in faded photos. Kansas City changed in ways he couldn't keep up with. Favorite shops closed, bars where Royals players once swapped stories after games vanished. Kids he met on the street, hearing the name George Brett, asked blankly, "Who are you?" Nothing cuts a legend deeper than that moment, not because fame faded, but because he realized a new generation was growing up without his memory, as if his life and career were becoming a tale only the old still told. Once at Kauffman Stadium, a boy asked Salvador Perez for an autograph, but passed Brett without a glance. The father whispered to his son, but the boy just shrugged. Brett smiled, but it was a smile, sad as winter rain. He understood every hero fades with time, fighting it only brought more pain. So Brett lived quieter, appeared publicly less. He spent mornings in physical therapy, afternoons reading papers, evenings watching TV with Leslie. It wasn't the life he'd envisioned, but it was the life 70 offered those who'd burned too much strength in the past. Yet in those quiet moments, loneliness always crept in. Not the loneliness of being unloved. Brett had family, friends, loyal fans. But there was a unique loneliness only living legends know, the loneliness of a man who gave everything but now has nothing left to fight for. No field to prove himself, no game to keep his heart ablaze, no spotlight to step into, hearing his name called, only time, something he couldn't hit, couldn't outrun, couldn't resist. And Brett, in his 70s, realized the deepest pain wasn't weak knees, stiff back, or fading sight. The deepest pain was the world spinning forward while he stood still, amid memories fading to sepia, amid a city that still loved him, but was growing in ways he no longer belonged to, amid the truth that legends live forever, but men do not. The 70s, with their tormenting pains and the loneliness of a vanishing generation, didn't make George Brett Jr. bitter or weary of life. Instead, they made him deeper, kinder, and closer to the Kansas City community in a way his legendary years never allowed time for. Without the crack of bat on ball, Brett found a new purpose, giving back to the young what he'd received, and what he'd once lacked. In his final years, he didn't live as an MLB hero, but as a father to the city. Brett began spending hours mentoring young Royals players, not on technique, they had coaches for that, but on mindset, grit and will. He sat for hours with rookies, listening to their pressures, self-doubts, slumps that made them want to quit. Then in the warm, weathered voice of age, he told them what he wished someone had said to him in youth. "You're not bad, you just haven't been coached right." Charlie Law's words, the teacher who saved Brett from the abyss, were now passed to a new generation. Young players said Brett never called himself a legend. He only said, "I was like you, scared of failing, scared I wasn't good enough. If I could stand up, you can too." And strangely, those words alone lifted many to play better, because no reward was greater than having Brett himself believe in them. Beyond players, Brett dove into baseball programs for Kansas City's poor youth. He stood on dusty fields where kids wore tattered gloves and chipped bats, teaching them stances and swings just as he'd learned. No cameras, no media, no endorsement deals, just Brett, an old man stooped with a gentle smile, showing kids the joy baseball once brought him. He didn't need them to become stars, he just needed them to have hope. A community worker once said, sometimes Brett got to the field before the kids. He'd pick up trash, clear bottles, fix the nets, then teach. No one loves baseball like him. It wasn't the image of a wealthy legend. It was the image of a man who'd given his life to a sport that saved him. And now, he was saving other kids. Brett's wealth, amassed over 21 seasons and decades advising the Royals, grew substantial. Houses, land, investments. He had enough to live grander than anyone in the city. But Brett chose simplicity. His car was old, his home wasn't lavish, his clothes hadn't changed in years. Because at this age Brett knew value didn't lie in what money could buy. Value lay in what he'd lost: time, family, memories, love. No treasure could reclaim. So when drafting his will, Brett didn't leave most of his wealth to his children. Not because he didn't love them, but because he wanted to leave them something greater, the lesson that a person's worth isn't in money, but in how they live and love. Nearly all his fortune, tens of millions, was directed to Kansas City's community: sports scholarships for poor kids, new baseball fields, training equipment, community teams and programs to steer youth from trouble. A legal aid recalled that when asked if he was sure about giving most of his wealth to the community, Brett just smiled and said, "Baseball gave me everything, I'm just giving a piece back." Perhaps the most heartbreaking thing Brett shared in his final years wasn't about a game, not the Pine Tar game, not the World Series, not the .390 season, not 3,154 hits. It was about family. One evening on his porch, he told his closest friend, in a voice so soft it was barely him, "My biggest regret isn't the strikeouts, it's the hugs I missed." To gain glory, Brett sacrificed moments he could never reclaim: nights reading bedtime stories to his kids, family movie evenings, school drop-offs, hugging his wife after a long day. He said, "I have thousands of hits, but I don't have thousands of memories with my kids." It wasn't self-blame. It was Brett facing a truth, not as glamorous as stadium lights, but the truest truth of life. His final years, though filled with pain and reflection, were his most beautiful, because for the first time, he lived slowly, he listened, he loved without rushing, he was present in ways his youth never allowed. He didn't need titles, didn't need cheers, didn't need press. All he needed was to see Kansas City, the city he'd loved his whole life, keep growing, keep hoping, keep proud of baseball. And he knew that when he was gone, what remained wouldn't be numbers, records, or statues. What remained was a legacy, written in the hearts of kids he lifted, in the memories of Kansas City's baseball lovers, and in the story of a man who wrestled darkness his whole life to become a light for the next generation. A legacy built with tears, loyalty, and scars time could never erase. As dusk falls over Kansas City, the day's final sunlight sweeps Kauffman Stadium's field like a faint golden veil over memories. In that scene, George Brett, 72, silver-haired, steps slow and heavy, walks the foul line as if entering his own dream. No cheers, no blazing scoreboards, no announcer calling his name, only the wind weaving through empty seats and the patient sound of an old man's footsteps, a man who lived his life in the spotlight, but found peace in the quiet twilight. He pauses near home plate, where he stood thousands of times, where his bat struck balls so fiercely America leaned in to watch. Now, it's just him in the vast stillness. Brett's eyes lift to the empty stands. Each seat holds a ghost. There, where a mother hugged her son when he hit his first home run. There, where his stern father sat silently watching his son play, never saying, "I'm proud of you." Farther out, where friends and fallen teammates once sat laughing, tossing towels to tease him after a hit. Now most are gone. That generation remains only in a few aged faces, leaning on canes at each other's funerals. Brett sighs, but a faint smile appears, the smile of a man who knows life, like baseball, always has a final season. Memories flood back, unordered, unprompted, scorching minor league days, crying in motel bathrooms, certain he'd fail. Anxious moments waiting, as doctors warned his back and knees might not hold. Days his children grew up without him, games he gritted through pain, still running, hitting, fighting for royal blue. And lonely nights after retirement, when applause vanished, when he had to learn to live in silence after a life of clamor. Those things once drained him. But now, looking back, Brett feels no pain. He sees meaning. A voice seems to rise from his heart, a life for baseball, but the cost was his body and heart, and he nods, as if agreeing with fate. He knows the price, a price not every legend dares pay. His body lost flexibility, agility, pain-free mornings. His heart lost family moments, missed hugs, peaceful years his youth never knew. But in return he left something money or fame can't buy: a legacy. To Brett, legacy isn't 3,154 hits, not batting titles across 3 decades, not the immortal .390 of 1980, not the 1985 championship ring, though it's his life's pride, nor in bronze statues, news articles, highlight reels. His true legacy lies in the heart he gave Kansas City, a heart fiercely loyal to a city that believed in him even when he doubted himself. Americans, fans of stats and records, sometimes forget that some legends aren't built on achievements alone. Some are built on kindness, on resilience, on pain, on unconditional love for a community. Brett is that kind of legend. He's not a flawless monument. He's not invincible, not cool, not transcendent, not gifted like other baseball geniuses. He's just a man who didn't quit. A man who knew he wasn't perfect, but fought like he had to save a city. A man not the fastest, not the strongest, but with a heart bigger than anyone who ever wore a Royals jersey. And that's what he left Kansas City. The sunset deepens. Brett walks slowly to the seats where he rested between games. He rests a hand on a chair, cold, but carrying thousands of stories he lived. He closes his eyes, letting the breeze brush his face, letting old sounds echo, the crack of bat on ball, fans roaring, the announcer calling his name, teammates' laughter in the locker room, and his heart pounding in every battle. But now in the vast, quiet stadium, Brett hears something new, a sound he never fully heard: peace. For the first time he doesn't need to prove anything. No more hits to make, no bases to run, no pain to push through. He only needs to stand here, under a sunset gentle as a final farewell, knowing he lived a life not wasted, a life of pain, but full, a life of sacrifice, but worth it, a life Kansas City will speak of with reverence. He places a hand on his chest, over the heart that nearly broke in grueling seasons. He closes his eyes, a soft breeze passes, and he smiles, a tired, breathtakingly beautiful smile. Because after all the wounds, all the losses, all the days of pushing to exhaustion, he realizes what Americans must remember: love, loyalty, kindness, are a life's true legacy. Glory isn't stats, not numbers, not trophies. Glory to Brett is the heart he gave wholly to Kansas City, holding nothing back. And as Brett stands alone in Kauffman Stadium at dusk, that smile says it all. To live like this, to love like this, to give like this, is an honor painful but beautiful beyond compare. Looking back on George Brett's life through this story, it's hard not to choke up realizing that behind Kansas City's icon is a man carrying wounds that never fully healed. We ache for the boy in El Segundo, always compared to his brother, raised in a home short on praise and hugs, hearing only "not good enough," carrying that shame from moldy minor league motel bathrooms, where he cried, thinking he'd fail forever, to nights he could barely stand, but stepped into the batter's box for the Royals. We pity the man of 1980, with America cheering his .400 chase, yet unseen as he left games for hemorrhoids, back pain, cramps, finishing with an immortal .390, while hearing inside, "I let them down again." Pity the moment he roared in the Pine Tar game, when a stolen home run didn't just spark anger, but unleashed a lifetime scream of being underestimated. Pity the 1985 hero, sobbing with a championship ring but asking himself at night why he still felt empty. Pity the aging father flipping through photo albums, seeing too many birthdays, school plays, bike falls he missed. And finally, pity the 72-year-old walking Kauffman Stadium at dusk alone, hand on chest, smiling peacefully after a life given to baseball at the cost of his body and heart. For Americans, this story reminds us that glory isn't just stats on a leaderboard, but how we stay loyal to our community, lift the next generation, admit wrongs to family, say "I wish I'd hugged them more." It urges us to balance dreams with loved ones, respect legends quietly aging among us, and understand that what lasts isn't applause, but the hearts we touch with kindness and loyalty. If George Brett's painful yet complete journey touched you, please subscribe to join us for more memory journeys. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next video where we'll continue honoring those who lived their lives for what they loved.